this video, we continue our journey along the Chicago Great Western route from Chicago to Olwine, Iowa, visiting all of the disused stations along the way. This time, we leave behind the Iowa Heritage Trail of Dubuque County and traverse into Delaware County, Iowa, visiting the former station of Petersburg, then onward to Almoral, and finally to Oneida. As always, we will explore railroad artifacts of interest along the way.
We leave behind our bicycles and the Iowa Heritage Trail, and instead we'll use our automobile, traveling into Delaware County, Iowa, where we'll find the next station along the former Chicago Great Western Line, which is Petersburg. Petersburg Station was about 4.8 miles to the west-northwest of Dyersville. Via the train, this trip took about 10 minutes. To get there, we head out of Dyersville along Beltline Road, which extends along the former CGW right-of-way. Before we leave Dyersville, however, we wanted to investigate another possible remaining artifact, a former bridge that we spotted on aerial photographs. We follow the Beltline Road branch that leads west-northwest, passing by St. Francis Cemetery, and we stop where the road bends north into a private driveway. Just a few hundred feet west of the road, we find the remarkable remains of a former CGW bridge, with 3 concrete piers and 2 stone abutments standing guard over Bear Creek, which drains to the south. The original bridge span was on the order of 75 feet. So amazing. Very glad we spotted this. From here, we head southeast back along Beltline Road for a short distance before turning south, following the south branch of Beltline, until we reach First Avenue. We turn right onto 210th Street, heading due west. After more than 3 miles, we turn right on 300th Avenue, heading due north. After 1¼ miles, we arrive at the former Petersburg Station, which stood to the west or left of the road, where prominent silos stand proud above the countryside.
The former Petersburg Depot was located about 250 feet west of 300th Avenue and about 100 feet south of 197th Street in Bremen Township, Delaware County, Iowa. The depot stood on the south side of the main line, with a single siding to the north of the line, running about 1,400 feet east to west. The depot itself was 16 feet by 40 feet in dimension when originally built, and was identical in size and design to the North Hanover Station. Viewers will recall that the North Hanover Station was a replacement for the earlier depot badly damaged by a railroad accident. A 30-foot extension was added to the Petersburg Station very early on, bringing its overall length to 70 feet. The station agent lived in a small house to the north of the depot and siding, and for most of the life of the Petersburg Station, this was Paul A. Atz. A warehouse also stood to the north of the siding, used primarily for the storage of wheat flour. Today, this former warehouse is part of Klosterman Brothers Incorporated, wholesale distributor of animal feeds and farm supplies. They were kind enough to share some old photos of the facility, as well as to let us explore the site. To the east of the road, stockyards were located to the north of the siding. Some stockyard buildings yet remain, as part of the Schmucker family trucking business, although these are likely of more recent vintage. The Schmucker family told us stories of the old railroad and showed us the original scales used with their livestock trade.
The community of Petersburg is actually some distance to the north of the station, about 3.5 miles, and the original surveyors of the Chicago, St. Paul, and Kansas City Railroad, later the Chicago Great Western, did not put Petersburg on the route northwest from Dyersville. Instead, the origins of the Petersburg Station trace its roots to the Roman Catholic Church built in Petersburg in the early years of the 20th century. When they built their church, Petersburg Town planners needed a way for building materials to be shipped into their site. And so, with the permission of the Chicago Great Western, they created a switch track for the freight for this purpose. This switch track, or siding, was located on property owned by the Kirchhoff family, and so became known as the Kirchhoff Switch, then later as the Petersburg Spur.
By 1904, this new switch stop was being used to receive materials for the building of the church, as well as the shipment of general goods to and from the Petersburg area. A general store was built here to take advantage of the new freight depot, and the emerging rail yard was routinely used for coal, lumber, and grain shipments. As the local population grew and prospered, in 1914, the Chicago Great Western made the decision to expand the utility of the Petersburg Station, making it a flag stop for passenger traffic. Records indicate that the new passenger depot was built in the 1915 to 1916 timeframe, when it also starts to appear on CGW timetables. The Chicago Great Western also added an agricultural warehouse, a baggage truck, and the ever-essential outhouse to the rail yard at about this time.
The Petersburg stop was an uneventful place for many years, but a major accident did occur nearby, about 1 mile west of here, in May of 1932. On that day, a westbound freight train went into the ditch along the right-of-way when an oil tank car derailed, turning perpendicular to the trackway and causing a dozen cars to pile into it. Thankfully, no one was injured.
By the early 1950s, the nearly 40-year-old depot was looking worse for wear. There was little passenger traffic on the Chicago Great Western by this time. And so, in September of 1954, the Petersburg Depot was demolished. The Petersburg Station Agency was also withdrawn. Within a year, the Chicago Great Western replaced the station building with a much smaller 8 by 10-foot Butler freight depot, as it had with many other rural stations. But this structure was only used for a few years, as Petersburg disappeared from CGW timetables by 1957.
The community of Petersburg was only about a decade or so older than the Chicago Great Western Railroad. Mostly German Roman Catholic immigrant farmers moved into the area a few decades prior. In 1873, the first signs of the community began with the building of a general store. Within a year, the store included a U.S. post office. The Roman Catholic parish of St. Peter and Paul was established for the emerging community, and a new church and parochial school were built. The little community prospered, and within a few years, Petersburg included 2 general merchandise stores, a harness maker, a blacksmith, a shoemaker, 2 wagon makers, and a millinery.
By the early 1900s, the population was stretching towards 100 residents. The populace decided that a new church was needed, and they wanted to build one that would signal their faith and the strength of their community to the surrounding countryside. They hired Dubuque architect Martin Heer to design an inspiring late Gothic Revival-style church. In 1905, the new church was constructed from cut stone, quarried from Stone City, Iowa, with spires reaching to 145 feet above the Iowa plains. The impressive exterior was complemented with a lavish interior, embellished with sacred appointments. The total cost of the building was about $85,000, or about $2.2 million in today's money, a remarkable feat and testament of faith for a community of a few dozen families.
Petersburg has persisted through the decades. Perhaps a few dozen homes and a few small businesses gathered together beneath the monumental St. Peter and Paul Church. It is today an unincorporated community in Bremen Township, Delaware County, Iowa, held together by more than 150 years of memory and perseverance.
Our next stop is Almoral, which was a little over 3 miles west-northwest from Petersburg. Via the train, this trip took about 5 to 10 minutes. We, of course, will take our automobile to get there. We depart Petersburg heading west along 197th Street. We travel for 2 miles west before turning south onto 280th Avenue. After a little more than a mile, we turn right onto 210th Street, heading west. We travel on this road for 1 mile, then turn right when we reach Northern or 270th Avenue. A little more than 1¼ miles along this road, we approach the former Almoral Station, which stood to the west or left of the road.
The Almoral Depot was located about 460 feet west of 270th Avenue and about 135 feet south of 185th Street in Oneida Township, Delaware County, Iowa. The station building stood on the north side of the main line, with a single siding south of the line, which extended more than 4,000 feet east to west. The original depot was recorded as being of standard early Chicago Great Western design, a wood frame building with gable ends, stick-style Victorian trim, and 22 feet by 55 feet in dimension. However, we have yet to see an actual photo of the Chicago Great Western Depot at Almoral.
Unlike Petersburg, Almoral was one of the original stations along the Chicago, St. Paul, and Kansas City line, appearing on train timetables as early as 1888. The station may originally have been a small freight office and a flag-stop platform for passengers, as a new depot building was constructed in 1894. Originally, it was referred to as Almoral Station, as Almoral proper was located 2 miles to the northwest of the new depot. Apparently, the Chicago Great Western appeared to be playing horseshoes when planning its route through many of these communities, not aiming for a ringer, but just close enough to score a point.
A U.S. post office was established at the new Almoral Station in 1898, within a general store built close by. The rail yard included stockyards as well. In 1910, the Chicago Great Western augmented the sidings of Almoral, and several years later, in 1916, crossing bells were added at the railroad crossing as a safety measure.
Like most rural stops on the Chicago Great Western, this station suffered its share of accidents over the decades. The worst of these, very reminiscent of the 1904 Dyersville wreck, occurred in the early days of the railroad, in 1890. At about 10:30 in the evening in mid-August, an eastbound freight train stopped at Almoral on the main tracks for a few hours while its engine was being repaired. Their crew unfortunately neglected to put out warning signals up and down the line. Predictably, another eastbound freight train came steaming down the track at 40 miles per hour in the darkness, unaware of the stalled train. When the arriving train crew saw the stopped train looming ahead of them, they slammed on the air brakes and jumped from the engine compartment. Their train crashed into the rear of the stalled train, piling up a wreck as high as the telegraph poles, according to one newspaper, totally destroying their engine and 28 freight cars, the wrecked mass of twisted metal and shattered wood immediately catching fire. As there was no water on hand, the fire burned unabated till the morning. 2 trainmen were badly injured in the accident.
A few decades later, in the spring of 1913, a freight train derailed near Almoral, where 10 refrigerated train cars, loaded with meat products, were ditched along the line. 2 local men were subsequently arrested for taking meat from the wrecked train. After grilling by local authorities and a searing rebuke by the judge, they pled guilty for their meaty offense and were burnt with a fine of $10 apiece, or about $200 in today's money.
Yet another amoral act of Almoral occurred in 1926, when local teenage boy Herbert Prideg caused a derailment of a freight train as a result of placing a large nut on the railroad track. Fortunately, no one was injured in this accident. The young man took accountability for his actions, and so the judge was lenient, noting that it was an act of thoughtlessness rather than as malice. The boy's sentence was suspended, and he was put under the supervision of his father. And we are happy to report that young Prideg became an upstanding member of his community thereafter.
The Almoral Station, meanwhile, was not as active as had been hoped for by the Chicago Great Western, some blaming this on the addition of the new Petersburg Station, which drew away both freight and passenger traffic. And so in 1928, Almoral Station Agency was closed down. 2 decades later, in 1947, the Almoral Depot was torn down and replaced with a half boxcar, which served as a freight depot. The Almoral Station hung on, however, and continued to appear on the Chicago Great Western schedules until at least 1962.
Today, the former rail yard is silent, surrounded by mostly open fields, about 400 yards to the north of Plum Creek. A handful of relatively modern homes along 185th Street overlook the former station site. Typically, we would have knocked on the doors of one or more of these homes to see what they knew of the railway, the former station site, and to ask permission if they were in fact the landowners. However, our visit there was marred by the presence of a few aggressive and unleashed dogs, who threatened us even as we got out of our vehicle, which was parked on a public street. For our own safety, we had no intention of going anywhere near the houses with the presence of these dogs. Instead, we worked quickly at the former station site, took what photos and footage that we could, and then quietly went on our way. Sadly, it was the least friendly site that we visited on our tour of the former Chicago Great Western stations.
Like Petersburg, the town of Almoral is quite distant from the train station, about 2 miles to the north-northwest. Its origins were long before the arrival of the Chicago Great Western Railroad. After the removal of the Native Americans, one of the first U.S. settlers to arrive here was the Reverend James H. Casson in 1854. Within a few years, he was visited by representatives of a group of Congregationalists from Massachusetts, who eyed his highly desirable land holdings and hoped to establish a religious community there. In addition to its superior farmland, there was much anticipation that the Dubuque and St. Paul Railroad would be built through this section. As it happened, it was built much further to the south.
Reverend Casson agreed to terms with the group and plotted the town of Almoral in 1857, centered initially by a log cabin school and a U.S. post office. As the Massachusetts Congregationalists were high on education, they built a large school building in 1858, known as the Almoral Institute, something of a high school or junior college for its day. The community was especially known for their music, producing the first brass band in Delaware County in 1858, as well as a church choir, which was believed to be one of the finest in the fledgling state. The brass band, however, was short-lived, when several members left in the early 1860s to fight in the U.S. Civil War.
The origin of the town name, which is somewhat unique, is obscure, perhaps indicating the religious origins of the community, suggesting that all is moral within their precinct. There was an apocryphal tale that the town name was originally supposed to have been Balmoral, after the English royal estate. But as the first postmaster did not like to write capital B's, he misplaced the first letter, creating Almoral. Given that Joseph B. Dunham was the postmaster from 1858 until after 1900, this story seems doubtful.
Despite its early ambitions and initial promise, the community failed to flourish. In fact, in the late 1890s, an attempt was made to reestablish the town along the Chicago Great Western, when the Des Moines and Northwestern Land and Loan Company purchased 20 acres nearby Almoral Station, laying out the new town and platting lots. Shortly thereafter, the Almoral Improvement Company was incorporated, purchasing several of these lots and building a large general store, a hotel, a blacksmith shop, a lumber yard, and stockyards, in hopes of luring in other retailers and businesses.
In something of a last hurrah for the original Almoral, with its population teetering at 25 to 30 residents, the community built a new Almoral Congregational Church in 1902 at the cost of $2,500. Or about $72,000 in today's money, a substantial investment for such a small community. The original Almoral post office closed that same year, as it was now being serviced by the Almoral Station post office.
But the new Almoral Station also failed to gain traction. The general store, which centered the small new community, lost its retail tenant within a few years of opening, and the Almoral Station U.S. Post Office closed by 1911. The Almoral Post Office was reestablished the following year in 1912, but this too did not hold, and the Almoral Post Office closed its doors in June of 1921. Attendance at the new Congregational Church dwindled, and the church was eventually abandoned. The original streets of Almoral, as well as the site of their Congregational Church, were all plowed under in the decades that followed. By 1940, the population of Almoral had dropped to less than 5 residents. Today, Almoral is a small unincorporated community within Oneida Township, Delaware County, Iowa, consisting of 10 or so homes.
The final stop along this leg of our Chicago Great Western journey is Oneida, more than 4.5 miles west-northwest along the former right-of-way. The train trip would have taken about 10 minutes. Via automobile, we'll first head south along Northern Avenue for a little more than a half mile before turning right or west onto 195th Street. After covering a distance of 3.5 miles, we turn right or north onto Iowa Route 38. Driving for 2.5 miles, we reach 170th Street, where we turn left or west. A little more than a half mile along this road brings us into the community of Oneida. At the west end of town, on our right, to the north of the road, stood the former Chicago Great Western Depot of Oneida.
The Chicago Great Western Depot at Oneida was located about 175 feet north of 170th Street and 350 feet west of 228th Street in Oneida, Delaware County, Iowa. The station structure stood on the north side of the main line tracks, with sidings to the south of the main tracks, extending for 4,500 feet, primarily to the east. The original depot was 22 feet by 55 feet in dimension and was of typical early CGW design, wood frame Victorian stick style, having been built in the early days of the railroad, as the station appears on the early timetables of 1888. The depot was later extended by about 15 feet in the 1900s. The station agent's home stood just a few hundred feet northeast of the depot building, and yet stands today as a private residence. We knocked on the door of this household, as they also owned the former station property to the west, which is now used to stable horses. The family spoke to us about the former railroads on their property and very kindly gave us permission to wander about the former station site.
It may be hard to believe today, but Oneida was once an important railroad town, with 3 separate railroads, including the Chicago Great Western, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, and the Manchester and Oneida, passing through the community. Indeed, it was a full stop for much of its lifetime along the Chicago Great Western route. The rail yards of all 3 must have kept the place buzzing in the early decades of the 20th century. But today all are gone, and the area has returned to a quiet, rural setting.
In 1910, the Chicago Great Western augmented the sidings for the Oneida rail yard. Crossing bells were added to the road crossing in 1916 as a safety feature. That same year, a concrete platform was installed at the depot. More reconstruction of the platform followed in 1922, as well as the addition of electric lighting. You can still see the remnants of the platform curbing at the former station site.
In the summer of 1907, locals took umbrage with Chicago Great Western section hands, specifically 27 Italian migrant laborers, for shooting so many of the local game birds, such as quail and meadowlarks. The flock of men were rounded up by heavily armed local authorities and hauled before a judge in nearby Manchester for their allegedly foul misdeeds. Alas, they only spoke pidgin English, and so remained caged for several days.
Accidents, too, some of them major, were not unusual at this heavily trafficked location. In mid-April of 1902, at about midnight, a Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul freight train was standing on the Chicago Great Western crossing. At the same time, a westbound CGW passenger train approached at high speed from the east, not knowing of the immobile crossing train. When the Chicago Great Western engineer spotted the standing train cars looming out of the darkness, he realized it was too late to brake, and instead put the engine on full throttle, blowing through 2 freight cars of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul train. Windows of the passenger train were blown out by flying timbers, and it took nearly a half mile for the CGW train to come to a stop given its speed. Fortunately, no one was seriously injured in this accident.
On a Saturday afternoon in September of 1904, an accident occurred which reminds us of the ongoing dangers of railroad workers. 41-year-old Elias Deo of Olwine, a Chicago Great Western brakeman, got off the train he was on when it stopped at Oneida to assist with the switching and coupling of a train car. In the confusion of the maneuver, he got caught between 2 cars, his body almost cut in 2 by the unexpected movement and massive force of the 2 train cars coming together. Elias left behind a wife and 7 children.
A final Oneida rail yard story tells of how a new railroad technology helped to avert a disastrous wreck. In February of 1911, a Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul train was passing over the grade-level crossing of the Chicago Great Western. Due to heavy fog, an approaching Chicago Great Western train did not see the train crossing until it was too late to brake. However, a previously installed derailing device at the interchange automatically dropped the CGW engine to the railroad ties, averting a collision and a major accident.
With the rise of overland trucking and improved roads, as well as a more powerful diesel engine, which could pull much longer trains, the need for interchanges and stops such as Oneida waned. The Oneida Depot was finally retired in 1950 and replaced with the freight boxcar. Charles Kimber, who had served as the Oneida Station agent since 1905 and lived in the nearby house, was given the final duty of closing the depot down. By 1957, the Oneida Station no longer appeared on the Chicago Great Western timetables, although the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul interchange was noted until at least 1962. The boxcar depot survived beyond the closure of the Chicago to Old Wine route in the 1970s, serving as a storage shed for the local landowner. However, the decaying structure was finally taken down in the past few years, as it was becoming a serious safety hazard.
There is one remaining significant structure associated with the Chicago Great Western that yet remains in Oneida, although hidden away and showing its age. Just 300 feet to the west of the Oneida Depot, a triple culvert concrete bridge still provides safe passage over Plum Creek.
The town of Oneida is intimately tied with the Chicago Great Western Railroad, although its roots go deeper still. The township of Oneida, within Delaware County, Iowa, was organized in 1855. The name is derived from the Eastern Native American tribe, one of the 5 founding tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy, although it's more likely that the township was named for either the county or city in New York State, rather than the Native American tribe directly. It was fairly common for the newly arriving migrants from eastern U.S. states to bring along familiar names with them. In the 1870s, the first railroad passed through this area. That was the Davenport and St. Paul, although there was as yet no station or stop here. By 1880, the Davenport and St. Paul was acquired by the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, making it part of a much larger railroad network in the U.S. Midwest.
When the Chicago, Kansas City, and St. Paul surveyors came through the area in 1886, the crossing and interchange with the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad was a natural place to situate a new station, as trains would often need to stop here in any event. A U.S. post office was immediately established at the site of the crossing for the new town in 1887, with the name of Oneida. Following its inception, the station of Oneida Junction began appearing on railroad maps by the mid-1890s, used for freight exchanges with the Chicago Great Western.
With 2 railroads now underfoot, Oneida officially came into being and was laid out as a town in 1896 by surveyor D.O. Potter for Elizabeth Hogue Barr and the Oneida Building and Improvement Company. But Oneida was not done with railroad building just yet. In the year 1900, the Manchester and Oneida Railroad was constructed from Manchester, Iowa, which was 7 miles to the southwest of Oneida, but about 8 miles when following the M&O right-of-way, which passed up along Honey Creek before heading due east across Delaware County, then angling northeast again until it came into Oneida Town.
This small but well-managed railroad was launched by a far-sighted Manchester commercial consortium, which had the single goal of making the freight services of the Chicago Great Western and Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul railroads accessible to the people and commerce of Manchester. The north terminus was the west end of Oneida, while the south terminus was located in the heart of Manchester. By August of 1901, Oneida was now host to 3 fully operational railroads. The Oneida Junction Depot, a smaller frame building to the south of the larger Chicago Great Western Depot, stood between the M&O line and the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul line.
This was the heyday of Oneida, when its population grew from 20 people to more than 200 by the early 1910s. The village had 2 or 3 general stores, a creamery co-op, a drugstore, a produce and poultry market, a blacksmith shop, a bank, a U.S. post office, a Methodist church, a school, and a few hotels, one well situated close by the 2 railroad depots, and another Great Western hotel along Main Street, although this one was far less extravagant than the one that viewers will recall was located in Stockton, Illinois. The Chicago Great Western also had coal sheds along the south edge of its sidings, while the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul had stockyards in the northwest corner of town.
Oneida was on the rise and incorporated as a town in 1912. Just 4 years later, in 1916, the young town built the Oneida Community School on 4 acres of land situated on its north edge, at a cost of about $20,000, or almost $400,000 in today's money. The large red brick building was a commodious 2 stories, featuring a clay tile roof. The first high school class graduated from this building in 1920.
But surprisingly, this is where Oneida's story begins to turn. At this critical stage in its growth, the town was unable to parlay its 3 railroads into broader commercial ventures to generate more local commerce with corresponding jobs and population rise. Instead, its fate lived and died with its 3 railroads. And as the railroad activity began to wane in the 1920s, so too did its population and its host of retailers. By the late 1920s, the population hovered at just above 100 residents.
Within a few decades, in 1947, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway closed its Oneida Junction station. 7 years later, in 1954, the M&O Railroad made its final run, after more than 50 years of efficient operation. And finally, as we saw earlier, the Chicago Great Western closed its passenger depot in 1950, with trains no longer stopping here after 1957.
The Oneida Community School saw its last high school graduating class in 1956. Then for 10 years, from 1959 till 1969, the school building was used as a special education facility. In the ensuing decades, Oneida lost its incorporation as a town. The once busy crossroads and its bristling railroad yards fell silent. Today, Oneida is a quiet, unincorporated community consisting of a dozen or so homes in Oneida Township, Delaware County, Iowa.
Many thanks to the Dyersville Historical Society, the Manchester Public Library, the folks at Klosterman Brothers, the Schmucker family, and the Thibodeau family. And of course, a big shout out to our first Patreons. Thank you so much for supporting our channel. If you are enjoying these videos, please remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment, and consider supporting our channel on Patreon. We hope to see you, in a manner of speaking, in our next video adventure.